What's going on, everybody? Just like the volume 12, there's also one more line which doesn't really go into the progression of volumes that I'm making. Like it was smoothly moving from classic to advanced, and it was a smooth flow with subtle changes. And I have one line of the exchange variation that doesn't really fit in anywhere. I mean, it does, but because we did have a couple other lines that were exchanged, but they weren't just exchanged. They had other names because of other characteristics. This line I'm going to cover is just an exchange variation, no other name. I think it's called the Rubenstein Attack once it gets far in there. So this is where we're going to cover it more or less. It's E4, C6, D4, D5, and then the exchange variation where white captures E takes D, and then C takes D. There are obviously a lot of exchange variation lines that we could cover, but none of them really require, I guess, me to cover them because it's just developing knights, castling, and etc. But this line we're covering because it's different. White develops both bishops first. So if white develops the light squared bishop to d3, this is the video for you. What we're going to do to start off is attack white's unprotected pawn with knight to c6. It's one of the few lines that you don't develop the bishop first. The next couple of videos are also knights developing first, and that's why I'm doing this video now. Now, white's best bet to defend that pawn is to march the c pawn up to c3, protecting it, since the bishop is blocking the queen's view of the pawn to protect it. So once white protects it, we're going to go ahead and develop the other knight to f6. And it doesn't make much sense for white to develop this knight because it blocks in the bishop. And it doesn't make much sense to develop this knight right now because that would allow black to pin it. So white's going to develop their bishop, and rather than pinning our knight like this, it's going to move to f4, eyeballing that open diagonal into our territory. And from here, we are going to develop our bishop to g4. Since it's covered by the knight, we're going to attack the queen. It obviously has the option to march up the pawn, but that would take the natural development square away from the knight. And it doesn't really want to develop the knight to e2 or f3 because we would just capture it and it would retake it with the queen, when white's best bet is to develop the queen on the queen side. So it'll do just that. Queen to b3, attacking our weak b7 pawn. So the bishop and the queen are gunning down our queen side, which doesn't really have too much protection right now. So we got to cover that b7 square somehow, and we will do it with developing the queen to d7. It's a square that doesn't hinder any other piece's development. From here, white will go ahead and move the knight to d2. Since that bishop is developed now, it's not blocking anything in. And we are going to go ahead and close our pawn structure up with e6 now. White will go ahead and develop the other knight to f3 now. It doesn't fear us capturing because it could just recapture with the knight and it doesn't mess up its pawn structure. So it's a good time to go ahead and develop that knight. And from here, we will try to exchange off bishops. White doesn't really have any good squares to put that. I mean, it's not pinning the knight here. There's nothing behind it. This would risk being captured and messing up pawn structure. And this square is just really bad overall. So it will go ahead and capture on d6, and we will recapture with our queen. From here, white not quite ready to recapture the pawn on b7. It's more worried about king safety at this point in time. I mean, if it did capture, I mean, there is nothing wrong with it, but we would come over with our rook, and then once it gets out of the way, we would invade their space. And now, you know, they're worried about us attacking their king. So it's going to go ahead and castle first. And we will follow suit and castle ourselves. Once both kings are safely tucked away, white will move over its rook to the semi-open file on the E rank. And from here, we are going to reposition our knight. We're going to bring our knight from c6 to e7. And that is because if that light squared bishop of ours gets jeopardized, we can put it on f5 and then recapture with our knight and be sitting pretty. And from here, white will go ahead and bring in its knight to e5, attacking our bishop, looking for tricks. So we have to move our bishop out of harm's way from the knight and into harm's way of the bishop. But it is covered with our knight on e7, so we have nothing to worry about. White is looking to trade off, so the bishop on d3 will capture f5, and we will recapture with the knight, jumping from e7 to f5. And that does allow the opportunity for the queen to come in and snag our pawn now. And we will throw back at the queen, moving our rook from a8 to b8. We don't want to do this rook because then the queen will go ahead and take our f pawn. That's the only rook it's the only piece that's covering that besides king. So we have to give up the a pawn if we want to kick it out. White will capture the a pawn on a7, but that allows us to come in deep and take the b2 pawn. And this is when the rook will move from e1 to e2, looking to jump out of the way shortly. And that's when we will go ahead and move our queen to b8, looking to exchange the queens now. White will gladly exchange the queens on b8, and we will capture finally with the rook on b8. And white can't move the knight yet because that would leave his rook unprotected, so it has to move over the king so that rook has protection. And that's when we're going to try to double up on the back rank, double up on the bubble up, pigs on the 7th or the 2nd, rook to c2. And that's when the knight will finally jump out of the way to b1. And it doesn't make any sense to... It would be a mistake to come in to check with the rook, because then white would recapture, and now we're leaving our rook on the c column hanging, because white's threatening a back rank checkmate with rook to b8. So we're going to throw in a check with rook c1, and white will defend. And yet again, it would be a mistake to capture anything, so we're going to jump back and try to force a repetition. And if white doesn't want to lose any advantage, it'll jump back to e2, and we just repeat. And we force a draw from this line. So it's just a quirk in the board that I wanted to go over. I guess, according to a grandmaster that I learned this line from, back in the day, from this position, it was kind of thought that white didn't have a good attack. But in recent times, it's figured out that it actually does by coming in with the queen and then putting his rook on the e2 square. So it's not very many variations, but it is kind of cool because you do force a draw on this line with the repeated dance of the rooks on e and c. So that just covers this single exchange variation, and I just had to get this out of the way, and we will catch you on the next video.